Hello and welcome to another tutorial video. I wanted to cover a topic this time that often doesn't get that much attention in interview prep materials and other online sources, but which is very important on the job, and that is the exchange ratio in M&A deals, specifically in 100% stock M&A deals, and how you can have a fixed exchange ratio, a floating exchange ratio, and then another structure to support this exchange ratio called a collar. Now, the typical question we get about this topic goes something like this. I saw a reference to an exchange ratio in a press release about a recent merger or acquisition. Can you explain what this means and why buyers and sellers use it? This is a good question because it reflects the difference between theory and practice. And as an example of the types of references that you'll often see, I have up here an investor presentation for this deal between Builders First Source and BMC Stock Holdings, these two home builders. And the exchange ratio here, what they say in the press release in this presentation is that BMC shareholders will receive 1.3125 Builders First Source shares for each BMC share. So that's an example of the types of language that you might see and what an exchange ratio in this context is referring to. In a lot of merger models, people will often assume that the buyer uses specific percentages of cash, debt, and stock to acquire the seller, mostly because it's just easier to set up models that way. So for example, here I have a very simple merger model, and we have an assumption for the premium paid for the target company B, and then we're assuming a certain percentage of cash, debt, and stock, 1/3 of each in this case. And then based on that, we make some assumptions for the cash used, the debt issued, and the number of shares issued of the acquirer to purchase the target. And it's very simple to set up financial models and merger models like this. The problem is that in real life, this assumption is less common in deals where a majority of stock or 100% of stock is used for the deal financing. The more common structure is to set up an exchange ratio and to say that the seller will receive X number of new shares of the buyer for each one of its own shares. Now, this exchange ratio could be anything. It could be 2-to-1. It could be 1.3125-to-1, like we saw in the press release. It could be 0.85-to-1. It just depends on the equity purchase price the buyer is paying for the seller. One approach to figure out what this exchange ratio might be is to figure out the premium that a buyer is willing to pay, which corresponds to a specific per share price, and then back into the exchange ratio from there. So for example, let's say that the seller's current share price is $20 per share and the buyer is willing to pay a 25% premium, which means a $25 per share offer price. Now, to show you how this works in Excel, I have a very simple model here with company A, company B. Company A's equity value or market cap is 400, company B's equity value or market cap is 100, and company B's current share price is $20. Company A's current share price is $20, but of course the difference is that company A has a whole lot more shares outstanding than company B. So if we go with this assumption and we say that we're going to pay a 25% premium for company B, we just take company B's current share price and we multiply by 1 plus 25%. So that gets us the offer price per share that we want to be paying for company B. Now, the buyer's share price, company A's share price here, is $20. And the formula for the exchange ratio is that you take the offer price per share and you divide by the buyer's current share price. So in this case, it would be $25 divided by $20. Let's go back into Excel and enter this. So for the exchange ratio here, I'm going to take the $25 per share offer price, and then we'll divide by the buyer's current share price of $20. That gets us our exchange ratio of 1.25x. And then based on that, we can figure out how many shares the buyer needs to issue to acquire the target here by taking the seller's current shares outstanding and then multiplying by this exchange ratio. Because remember, for each one of the seller's shares, they're going to get 1.25 of the buyer's shares. Therefore, to complete this deal, we have to issue 6.25 million shares to the seller's shareholders. And then if we just continue this and I enter some more information here, if we look at the purchase equity value, this is just going to be equal to the offer price per share for the seller multiplied by shares outstanding. And then the purchase enterprise value will just be the purchase equity value plus all the items in the enterprise value bridge. So subtract cash, add debt, preferred stock, non-controlling interests. For the shares issued to the seller, we just link to our number here. And then we can also calculate the ownership based on this assumption. So for the buyer ownership, we are going to take the buyer's shares outstanding and then divide by the buyer's shares outstanding plus the new shares issued in this deal. That gets us to about 76% for the buyer, and the seller is just 1 minus that. So that's how we can do some math around this. As a result, the seller gets 1.25 buyer shares for each one of its shares. If you've been paying attention, you probably noticed an issue with this setup and the exchange ratios in general, which is that what happens if the buyer's share price falls when the deal is announced? The seller will get a much lower purchase price potentially because the buyer's shares will be worth less. Let's illustrate that in Excel. So let's go down and say that the buyer announces this deal, the market really doesn't like it, and it penalizes the buyer and says that, you know what, we're going to sell off your shares, we're going to force your share price down, and so now you're only going to be worth $15 per share. And in addition, the exchange ratio here is not going to change. So I'm going to copy and paste this as a value because we want this to stay the same. This is what the buyer has offered. And then after it's made this offer, its share price changes. So its share price falls to $15 per share. And what happens is that they still issue the same number of shares to the seller, the 6.25 million here. But the purchase equity value is going to fall because in reality, what the seller is getting here is the number of shares that are issued times the buyer's current share price of the $15 per share right here. And so the seller here ends up with a purchase equity value of 93.8 million as opposed to that 125 million that we saw before. And it's all because the buyer's share price here dropped from $20 to $15 after the deal was announced. So when you make an offer like this and you have a fixed exchange ratio and you look at how much the seller is actually getting based on the shares it gets, there is a huge risk because if the buyer's share price changes, the seller is going to get a very different price in this deal. One solution here is to base this on a floating exchange ratio that is linked to the equity purchase price rather than a fixed exchange ratio that's linked to the shares issued. With a floating exchange ratio, the seller receives a fixed purchase price, but a variable number of shares. So what this means is that if the buyer's share price goes up, the seller simply gets fewer shares, but the same price. And if the buyer's share price goes down, the seller gets more shares, but the same price. So let's go in and see how this works. I'm going to change this and I'm going to say that we'll use a floating exchange ratio right here for the exchange ratio type. Then let's go down to our floating exchange ratio assumptions. We'll use the same equity purchase price of 125 million here. And then for the shares issued to the seller, let's take this number and then divide by the buyer's current share price. Let's actually set the buyer's current share price back to 20 for now, just so you can see this. And then for the exchange ratio, we'll just take the number of shares issued and divide by the seller's share count right here. So this gets us to our 1.25x exchange ratio. And so over here in our assumptions on the side, we can change these a bit. And we can now say that if we are dealing with a fixed exchange ratio, then we will use our familiar formula that we entered before. But if we're not dealing with it, if we're dealing with a floating exchange ratio, then we'll link to our equity purchase price down here instead. So we have that. And then for the shares issued for the seller, it's the same idea. We'll look at this and say that if it's a fixed exchange ratio, we'll link to our number there. Otherwise, we will link to what we calculated down here. And so we have that. And so with a floating exchange ratio like this, you can immediately see the differences. Because if the buyer's share price falls to say 15, once again, the seller gets the same equity purchase price. They still get that purchase equity value of 125 million here. It's just that now they get 8.333 million shares and they end up owning more like 29% of the company as opposed to the lower number that they had before. They only owned about 23 or 24% when the buyer's share price was at $20 per share. So this is how a floating exchange ratio works in this context. Of course, there are some issues with this as well. They don't solve our problems, these solutions, because the buyer and the seller might have different concerns in this particular deal. For example, the buyer normally doesn't want its share price to fall and lose ownership in the new company. It's most concerned about preserving its ownership position and its ability to control this new company. The seller, on the other hand, wants as much ownership as possible, and they want to maintain a similar purchase price. It's okay if it changes a little bit, maybe, but they don't want their purchase price to go down by 30% just because the buyer's share price falls. So they have inherently contradictory goals because one party wants as much ownership as possible, and then the other party also wants as much ownership as possible. And when you get a situation like this, one solution is to compromise. And in this case, with M&A deals that are based on stock, you can use a structure known as a collar. This modifies the normal fixed and floating exchange ratios and changes their behavior within certain share price ranges. We're going to look at a fixed exchange ratio with a collar first, then we'll look at a floating exchange ratio with a collar. Now with the first one, a fixed exchange ratio with the collar, the exchange ratio is fixed within a range of buyer share prices, but it becomes a floating exchange ratio outside of it. So for example, here, if the buyer's share price stays between $15 and $25, then maybe the exchange ratio remains fixed at 1.25x, and that's fine. And then below $15, the buyer has to issue more shares such that the seller receives a minimum purchase price of $93.8 million, and above $25 per share, the buyer issues fewer shares such that the seller receives a maximum purchase price of $156.3 million. So we get a floating exchange ratio below $15 per share and above $25 per share. Let's go into Excel and set this up so you can see how it works. I'm actually going to delete everything I entered here because this is no longer going to be relevant. We'll keep our baseline exchange ratio. We'll change this back to a fixed exchange ratio. These numbers are all wrong, but it's okay. We'll get to fixing these in a little bit. And this time we'll say that we do want to use a collar. So I'll enter 1 right here. And then for the share price floor, we're going to say 15. For the cap, we're going to say 25. So the first thing to do here is to calculate the offer price when the acquirer's share price hits this floor and also when it reaches its cap. So we'll take the fixed exchange ratio and multiply by this number. And then we'll take the fixed exchange ratio and multiply by the share price cap. We get that. And then let's also calculate it for when it's not at either of those, when it's somewhere in the middle. So we'll take the fixed exchange ratio and multiply by the buyer's current share price here. I'm actually going to set this back to 20 for now so you can see the differences between all of these. And then for the actual offer price per share. So first, let's see if we're actually using a collar. And if we are, so if this equals 1, or I could just write it like this, because if use collar and fixed ER, if that's true, then it'll be 1 and Excel will recognize it anyway. So I'll just write it like that. And I'll take the minimum between the maximum of our offer price at the floor and then our offer price between the floor and the cap. And then I will compare that to the offer price at the cap. So this formula may look a little bit confusing, but essentially all it's doing is saying that if we are between the floor and the cap, we're going to use whatever offer price is here. But if we are below the floor, then we're going to bump it up to this 1875. And if we're above the cap, on the other hand, we're going to bump this down to the 3125. And if you play around with this in Excel, you'll see how it works. But essentially, that's what the min-max here is doing. And it's just a more elegant way to write this as opposed to using a bunch of if statements. Now, if that's not true, if we're not using a collar, then we're just going to use the normal fixed exchange ratio and multiply by the buyer's share price down here. And so we have that. Now we can calculate the actual exchange ratio based on this actual offer price. So we'll take this and divide by the buyer's share price. And then for the shares issued to the seller, we'll just take our actual exchange ratio and multiply by the seller's shares outstanding right here. And so we have that. And all of these formulas look fine. If you want to see visually what this looks like, I'm going to go over to the exchange ratios tab over here. And I've set up a graph with the fixed exchange ratio with a collar and also one without a collar. If you look at this without a collar, you can see right here that the equity purchase price keeps changing. That's the blue line here, but the target's ownership stays the same. With a collar, you can see what happens. The equity purchase price hits a minimum and then also hits a maximum as the acquirer's share price changes. But then the target's ownership keeps going up as the acquirer's share price falls. Right in the middle of the range, the target's ownership stays the same. And then as the acquirer's share price keeps increasing, the target's ownership keeps going down because the acquirer needs to issue fewer and fewer shares to complete this type of deal. So that's what a fixed exchange ratio with a collar looks like. You can also try playing around with the numbers here and seeing what happens. If we change the acquirer's share price to say 5, we get a big difference in the ownership, but the purchase equity value remains at that minimum 93.8 million. On the other hand, if the share price goes up to say $50 per share, we still have that maximum purchase equity value of 156.3 million, but the buyer ends up owning a whole lot more of the combined company because now they need to issue fewer shares to do this deal. So that is a bit about the fixed exchange ratio with a collar. It just makes it easier to negotiate a deal because now both sides can get some protection. If the buyer is worried about the target's ownership, it can negotiate a deal like this, which fixes the ownership within ranges and lets it vary outside that. If the target is worried about the purchase price, it can set a floor and a cap on the purchase price and get some protection with the structure. Now, there's also a floating exchange ratio with a collar where the exchange ratio is floating within a certain range but becomes fixed outside of it. So for example, maybe the base ratio is 1.25x here. It increases as the buyer's share price falls. It decreases as the buyer's share price rises. And so we might say that maybe above the 1.667 range, it stays fixed at that 1.667. So the purchase price drops, but the seller's ownership stays the same. But then below 1x, maybe it stays fixed at 1x. So the purchase price increases, but the seller's ownership stays the same below that level. Here's what this one looks like in Excel. I'll go over to the exchange ratios tab once again. So a standard floating exchange ratio looks something like this, where the target's ownership here keeps changing, that's the red line, as the acquirer's share price changes. As the acquirer's share price goes lower, the seller gets more of the combined company. As the acquirer's share price goes up, the seller here, gets less of the combined company, but the equity purchase price, the blue line, always stays the same. Now, when you have a collar on this structure instead, the target's ownership is capped within a certain range. It can go up to a maximum of around 30% or so, it looks like, and then it can go to a minimum here of around 20%, just below 20%, something in that range. However, the equity purchase price can vary, and it stays the same within this certain range of share prices, $15 to $25 for the acquirer, but then above that, the equity purchase price can keep going up, and then below that, the equity purchase price can keep going down. So once again, this is just helpful for negotiations, because if the main concern here of the acquirer is the ownership, this structure is often ideal because it lets the acquirer cap the target's ownership a little bit and set it to a certain maximum and also a certain minimum and let it vary between those numbers. You might now be asking what all this means and what relevance it has for you. And the short answer is that this is definitely more of an on-the-job topic than what we usually cover in this channel. The relevance is that you need to be careful when making assumptions in merger models in real life, or you're going to get very strange behavior when companies' share prices start changing. Because, for example, if you want to create a sensitivity that shows what happens when the acquirer's share price changes, and you don't have these assumptions with the collar or the exchange ratio set up correctly, the math is not going to work. You're going to start seeing cases where the equity purchase price starts changing as the acquirer's share price changes, or maybe it stays the same, and maybe it's not working correctly because you haven't set up these assumptions correctly in your model. Oftentimes, it's better to create a whole separate set of assumptions for the 100% stock scenario, because it really is quite different from just using simple percentages for cash, stock, and debt. So you'll often get better results if you just separate it out and create a different set of assumptions here. And you have to be really careful when reading press releases and analyzing past deals, because often the purchase price is not exactly what the article stated, and so you have to do some detective work and figure out what the effective offer price actually was based on the acquirer's share price, the exchange ratio, and any collar used in the deal. Let's do a recap and summary now. 100% stock M&A deals in real life are almost always based on exchange ratios. In other words, the seller will receive X number of new shares of the buyer for each one of its own shares. The main risk here is that the buyer's share price might change, and specifically it might fall, which will be really bad for the seller because it will own the same amount of the company, but its purchase price, the effective purchase price, will be a lot lower. One solution is to use a floating exchange ratio to guarantee the same purchase price regardless of the buyer's share price. And you saw how that worked here, where with a floating exchange ratio, the target always gets the same price, but its ownership changes based on the acquirer's share price changing. Of course, both sides often don't like this because the buyer doesn't want changing ownership and the seller doesn't necessarily want much lower ownership if the buyer's share price goes up. So another solution is to use a fixed or floating exchange ratio with a collar to fix the purchase price or the number of shares issued within certain buyer share price ranges. And you saw how that worked, where with one of these, you can set a floor and a cap on the equity purchase price. And then with the other, you can set a cap and a floor on the target's ownership percentage. And these help to negotiate deals and help both sides get what they want. That's about it for this tutorial. I hope you've learned something about deal structuring and how exchange ratios, fixed and floating, work in real life, as well as how this structure works when you have a collar attached to these types of exchange ratios.